So, hello and welcome back yet again to Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, where I feel like things are finally starting to happen. I'm not sure exactly what is happening all of the time, but I'm getting the gist of it. It's really hard sometimes to chew through early 19th century language structure. Sometimes I'm reading this and I'm like, I know I'm reading words, but I'm not sure what they mean. And then I can go back and like listen or read over it again and it comes clear to me, but sometimes this book can get a little wordy. I hope you guys are doing okay. I hope that it started to cool off a little bit for you. We got a lot of rain yesterday, and this morning it felt better. It's still really humid, but I got out just a little while ago, actually. In fact, it was the video that should have been up before this one. I got out and just took a walk this morning because I've been really missing getting out and walking. It's just been so stupidly hot that it's hard to motivate yourself. But hopefully, we are coming into a cooler season. Hopefully, the dog days of summer are done. I found out, totally different subject. Well, not really. I found out that it's called the dog days of summer because Sirius, which is in the dog constellation, Sirius, is at its brightest during this time of the year. The more you know. The more you know. Anyway, it sounds like we are about to head to a Renaissance fair. No, not a Renaissance fair, but we are going to be heading to a medieval tournament, and the pilgrim, who I am starting to suspect might just be our title character Ivanhoe, has gotten a horse and armor, or at least the promise of a horse and armor, so he can compete in this tournament. Maybe. Maybe that's what's going on. I don't know. I guess we'll find out, though, won't we? We have a fairly long quote at the start of this chapter, so I guess we're just gonna jump into it with this quote from a book question mark that I've never heard of. Knights, with a long retinue of their squires, in gaudy liveries march in quaint attires. One lanced the helm, another held the lance, a third the shining buckler did advance. The courser pawed the ground with restless feet, and snorting foamed and champed the golden bit. The smiths and armorers on palfreys ride, flies in their hands and hammers at their side. And nails for loosened spears and thongs for shields provide. The yeomen guard the streets in seemly bands, and clowns come crowding on with cudgels in their hands. And that's from Palamon and Archite. No clue what that is. If you know, drop it in the comments down below. And we are going to begin Chapter 7 of Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. The condition of the English nation was at this time sufficiently miserable. King Richard was absent, a prisoner, and in the power of the perfidious and cruel Duke of Austria. Even the very place of his captivity was uncertain, and his fate but very imperfectly known to the generality of his subjects, who were in the meantime prey to every species of subaltern oppression. Prince John, in league with Philip of France, Coeur de Lion's mortal enemy, was using every species of influence with the Duke of Austria to prolong the captivity of his brother Richard, to whom he stood indebted for so many favors. In the meantime, he was strengthening his own faction in the kingdom, of which he proposed to dispute the succession in the case of the king's death. along with the legitimate heir, Arthur, Duke of Brittany, son of Geoffrey Plantagenet, the elder brother of John. This usurpation, it is well known, he afterwards effected, his own character being light, profligate, and perfidious. John easily attached to his person and faction not only all who had reason to dread the resentment of Richard for criminal proceedings during his absence, but also the numerous class of lawless resolutes whom the Crusaders had turned back on their country, accomplished in the vices of the East, impoverished in substance and hardened in character, who placed their hopes of harvest in civil commotion. To these causes of public distress and apprehension must be added the multitude of outlaws who, driven to despair by the oppression of the feudal nobility and the severe exercise of forest laws, banded together in large gangs and, keeping possession of the forests and the wastes, set at defiance the justice and majesty of the country. The nobles themselves, each fortified within his own castle, and playing the petty sovereign over his own dominions, were the leaders of bands scarce less lawless and oppressive than those of the avowed depredators. To maintain these retainers, and to support the extravagance and magnificence which their pride induced them to affect, the nobility borrowed sums of moneys from the Jewish people at a most usurious interest, which gnawed into their estates like consuming cankers, scarce to be cured unless when circumstances gave them the opportunity of getting free by exercising upon their creditors some act of unprincipled violence. Under the various burdens imposed by this unhappy state of affairs, the people of England suffered deeply for the present, and had yet more dreadful cause to fear from the future. To augment their misery, a contagious disorder of a dangerous nature spread through the land, and rendered more virulent by the uncleanness, indifferent food, and the wretched lodging of the lower classes, swept off many whose fate the survivors were tempted to be envious of, since it exempted them from the evils which were still to come. Yet amid these accumulated distresses, the poor as well as the rich, the vulgar as well as the noble, in the event of a tournament, which was a grand spectacle of that time, felt as much interested as the half-starved citizen of Madrid, who has not a real left to buy provisions for his family, feeling an issue of a bull feast. Neither duty nor infirmity could keep the youth or the aged from these exhibitions. The passage of arms, as it was called, which was to take place at Ashby, in the county of Leicester, as champions of the first renown, were to take the field in the presence of Prince John himself, who was expected to grace the lists, and this had attracted universal attention, and an immense confluence of people of all ranks hastened upon the appointed morning towards the place of combat. The scene was singularly romantic. On the verge of a wood, which approached to within a mile of the town of Ashby, was an extensive meadow of the finest and most beautiful green turf, surrounded on one side by the forest, and fringed on the other by straggling oak trees, some of which had grown to immense size. The ground, as if fashioned on purpose for a martial display which it was intended for, sloped gradually down on all sides to a level bottom, which was enclosed for the lists with strong palisades, forming a space of a quarter-mile in length and about half that in breadth. The form of the enclosure was an oblong square, save that the corners were considerably rounded off, in order to afford more convenience for the spectators. The openings for the entry of the combatants was at the northern and southern extremities of the lists, accessible by strong wooden gates, each wide enough to admit 2 horsemen riding side by side. At each of these portals were stationed 2 heralds, attended by 6 trumpeters, as many pursuivants, and a strong body of men at arms to maintain order and ascertain the quality of the knights who wanted to engage in this martial game. On a platform beyond the southern entrance, formed by a natural elevation of the ground, were pitched 5 magnificent pavilions, adorned with pennons of russet and black, the chosen colors of the 5 knight challengers. The cords of the tents were of the same color. In front of each pavilion was suspended the shield of the knight by whom it was occupied, and next to it stood his squire, quaintly disguised as a salvage or Sylvan man, or in some other fantastic dress, according to the taste of his master and the character he was pleased to assume during the games. The central pavilion, as the place of honor, had been assigned to Brian de Bois Guilbert, whose renown in all games of chivalry, no less than his connection with the knights who had undertaken this passage of arms, had occasioned him to be eagerly received into the company of challengers and even adopted as their chief and leader, even though he had just recently joined them. On one side of his tent were pitched those of Reginald Front de Bœuf and Richard, also known as Philip, de Malvision, and on the other was the pavilion of Hugh de Grantmesnil, a noble baron in the vicinity, whose ancestor had been High Lord Steward of England during the time of the Conqueror and his son William Rufus. Ralph de Vipont, a knight of St. John of Jerusalem, who had some ancient possessions at a place called Heather near Ashby de la Zouche, was the occupant of the 5th pavilion. From the entrance into the lists, a gently sloping passage 10 yards in breadth led up to the platform on which the tents were pitched. It was strongly secured by a palisade on either side, as was the esplanade in front of the pavilions, and everything was guarded by men-at-arms. The northern access to the lists terminated in a similar entrance of 30 feet in breadth, at the extremity of which was a large enclosed space for such knights as might be disposed to enter the lists with the challengers, behind which were placed tents with refreshments of every kind for their accommodation, with armorers, farriers, and other attendants in readiness to give their services wherever they might be needed. The exterior of the lists was in part occupied by temporary galleries spread with tapestry and carpets, and accommodated with cushions for the convenience of those ladies and nobles who would attend the tournament. A narrow space betwixt these galleries and the lists gave accommodations for yeomanry and spectators of a better degree than the mere vulgar, and might be compared to the pit of a theatre. The promiscuous multitude arranged themselves upon large banks of turf that had been prepared for the purpose, which, aided by the natural elevation of the ground, would enable them to overlook the galleries and obtain a fair view down into the lists. Besides the accommodation which these stations afforded, many hundreds had perched themselves on the branches of the trees which surrounded the meadow, and even up on the steeple of a country church at some distance had been crowned with spectators. It only remains to notice, respecting the general arrangement, that one gallery, in the very center of the eastern side of the lists, and consequently exactly opposite to the spot where the shock of the combat was to take place, was raised higher than the others, more richly decorated, and graced by a sort of throne and canopy, on which the royal arms were emblazoned. Squires, pages, and yeomen in rich livery waited around this place of honor, which was designed for Prince John and his attendants. Opposite the royal gallery was another elevated to the same height on the western side of the lists, and more gaily, if less sumptuously decorated than that destined for the prince himself. A train of pages and young maidens, the most beautiful who could be found, gaily dressed in fancy habits of green and pink, surrounded a throne decorated in those colors. Among the pennons and flags, bearing wounded hearts, burning hearts, and bleeding hearts, bows, quivers, and all the common emblems of the triumphs of Cupid, a blazoned inscription informed the spectators that this is the seat of honor designed for La Royaume de Beauté de Amour. But who was to represent the Queen of Beauty and Love on the present occasion? No one knew. Meanwhile, the spectators of every description thronged forward to occupy their respective stations, and not without many quarrels concerning those which they were entitled to hold. Some of these were settled by the men-at-arms with little ceremony, the shafts of their battle-axes and the pommels of their swords readily employed as arguments to convince the more troublesome patrons. Others, which involved the rival claims of more elevated people, were determined by the heralds or the two marshals of the field, William de Wyville and Stephen de Martival, who, armed at all times, rode up and down the lists to enforce and preserve good order amongst the spectators. Gradually, the galleries became filled with knights and nobles, in their robes of peace, whose long and rich tinted mantles were contrasted with the gayer and more splendid habits of the ladies, who, in a greater proportion than even the men themselves, came to witness a sport which one would have thought too bloody and dangerous to afford their gender much pleasure at all. The lower and interior space was soon filled by substantial yeomen and burghers, and of such of the lesser gentry as, from modest poverty or dubious titling, dared not take a higher place. It was, of course, amongst these that the most frequent disputes for their precedence were occurring. "Dog of an unbeliever," said an old man, whose threadbare tunic bore witness to his poverty, as his sword and dagger and golden chain intimated at his pretension to rank. "Whelp of a she-wolf, I darest thou press upon a Christian and a Norman gentleman of the blood of Montdidier?" This rough address was addressed to none other than our good acquaintance Isaac, who was richly, even magnificently dressed in a gabardine ornamented with lace and lined with fur, as he endeavored to make a place in the foremost row beneath the gallery for his daughter, the beautiful Rebecca, who had joined him at Ashby, and who was now hanging on her father's arm, a little terrified by the popular displeasure which seemed generally to be excited by her parents' presumption. But Isaac, though we have seen him sufficiently timid on other occasions, knew right now at present he had nothing to fear. It was not in places of general resort, or where their equals were assembled, that any avaricious or malevolent noble would offer him injury. At meetings like this, the Jewish people were under protection of the general law, and if that produced a weak assurance, it usually happened that there were among their persons assembled some barons who, for their own interested motives, were ready to act as their protectors. Right now, Isaac felt more than usually confident, being aware that Prince John was even then in the very act of negotiating quite a large loan from his people, to be secured upon certain jewels and lands. Isaac's own share in this transaction would be considerable, and he well knew that the prince's eager desire to bring it to a conclusion would ensure he was protected in the dilemma which he was currently embroiled in. Emboldened by these considerations, Isaac pursued his point and jostled the Norman Christian without respect to either his descent, quality, or religion. The complaints of the old man, however, excited the indignation of the bystanders. One of these, a stout, well set up yeoman, arrayed in Lincoln green, having 12 arrows in his belt and a baldric and badge of silver, along with a bow of 6 feet of length in his hand, turned short round, and well his countenance, which his constant exposure to the weather had rendered brown as a hazelnut, got dark with anger. He advised Isaac to remember that all the wealth which he had acquired by sucking the blood of his miserable victims had swelled him like a bloated spider, which might be overlooked if he stayed in a corner, but a spider would be crushed if it ventured into the light. These words, delivered in Norman English with a firm voice and a stern aspect, made Isaac shrink back, and he would probably have withdrawn himself altogether from an area so dangerous, had not the attention of everyone been called right then by the entrance of Prince John, who at that very moment entered the lists, attended by numerous and a very gay train, consisting partly of laymen, partly of churchmen, as light in their dress and gay in their demeanor as their companions were. Among these was the prior of Jorvalas, in a most gallant trim which a dignitary of the church could possibly exhibit. Fur and gold were not spared in his garments, and the point of his boots, out-Heroding the preposterous fashion of the time, turned up so very far as to be attached not merely to his knees, but to his girdle, and these effectively prevented him from putting his foot into a stirrup. This, however, was a slight inconvenience to the gallant abbot, who, perhaps even rejoicing in the opportunity to display his horsemanship in front of so many people, especially the women, dispensed with the use of these supports to a timid rider. The rest of Prince John's retinue consisted of the favorite leaders of his mercenaries, some marauding barons, and many attendants upon the court, with several Knights Templar and Knights of St. John. It may be here remarked that the knights of those two orders were accounted hostile to King Richard, having adopted the side of Philip of France in the long-running disputes which took place in Palestine between that monarch and the lion-hearted King of England. It was the well-known consequence of this discord that Richard's repeated victories had been rendered fruitless, his romantic attempts to besiege Jerusalem disappointed, and the fruit of all the glory which he had acquired had dwindled to an uncertain truce with the Sultan of Saladin. With the same policy which had dictated the conduct of their brethren in the Holy Land, the Templars and the Hospitallers in England and Normandy attached themselves to the faction of Prince John, having little reason to desire the return of Richard to England, or the succession of Arthur, his legitimate heir. For the opposite reason, Prince John hated and condemned the few Saxon families of consequence which were still in England, and omitted no opportunity of mortifying and affronting them, being conscious that his person and pretensions were also disliked by them, as well as by the greatest part of the English commoners, who feared further innovation upon their rights and liberties from a sovereign of John's licentious and tyrannical disposition. And so, attended by this gallant equipage, well mounted and splendidly dressed in crimson and gold, bearing upon his hand a falcon, and having his head covered by a rich fur bonnet, adorned by a circle of precious stones from which his long curly hair escaped and overspread his shoulders, was Prince John, upon a gray and high-mettled palfrey, caracoled within the lists at the head of a jovial party, laughing loud with his train, and eyeing with all boldness of royal criticism the beautiful women in the lofty galleries. Those who remarked on the physiognomy of the prince a dissolute audacity, mingled with extreme haughtiness and indifference to the feelings of others, they could not yet deny to his face that a sort of comeliness which belongs to an open set of features well formed by nature, modeled by art to the usual rules of courtesy, yet so far frank and honest that they seemed as if they disclaimed to conceal the natural workings of the soul. Such an expression is often mistaken for manly frankness when, in actuality, it comes from the reckless indifference of a libertine disposition, conscious of superiority of birth, wealth, or of some other advantageous advantage, which is totally unconnected with any personal merit. To those who did not think so deeply, the splendor of Prince John's fur tippet, the richness of his cloak lined with the most costly sable, his Marquin boots and golden spurs, together with the grace with which he managed his horse, were enough to bring on clamorous applause. In his joyous turn round the lists, the attention of the prince was called by the commotion which had not subsided, which had attended the ambitious movement of Isaac towards higher places in the assembly. The quick eye of Prince John instantly recognized Isaac, but was much more agreeably attracted by his beautiful daughter, who, terrified by the noise, was clinging close to her aged father. The figure of Rebecca might indeed have compared with the proudest beauties of England, even though, had it been judged by as shrewd a connoisseur as Prince John, her form was exquisitely symmetrical, and shown to advantage by a sort of Eastern dress which she wore according to the fashion of the people of her nation. Her turban of yellow silk suited well to her dark complexion. The brilliancy of her eyes, the superb arch of her eyebrows, her well-formed aquiline nose, teeth white as pearl, and the profusion of her sable tresses, which, each arranged in its own little spiral of twisted curls, fell down as much of a lovely neck and bosom as a samar of the richest Persian silk, exhibiting flowers in their natural colors, embossed upon purple, permitted to be visible. All of this constituted a combination of loveliness which yielded not to the most beautiful of maidens surrounding her. It is true that of the golden and pearl-studded clasps which closed her vest from the throat to the waist, the three top ones were left unfastened on account of the heat, which something enlarged the prospect to which we were alluding. The diamond necklace, with pendants of unknown value, were by this means also made more conspicuous. The feather of an ostrich, fastened in her turban by an agaf set with brilliants, was another distinction of this beautiful woman, scoffed and sneered at by the proud dames who were sitting above her, but envied by those who affected to also deride her. "Oh, by the bald scalp of Abraham," said Prince John, "that woman must be the very model of that perfection whose charms drove frantic the wisest king that ever lived. What sayest thou, Prior Aymer? By the temple of that wise king, which our wiser brother Richard proved unable to recover, she could be the very bride of Canticles." "The rose of Sharon, the lily of the valley," said the prior in a snuffling tone. "But your grace must remember she's Jewish." "Aye," said Prince John. "And there's my mammon of unrighteousness, too. The Marquis of Marks, the Baron of Byzance, contesting for a place with penniless dogs, whose threadbare cloaks have not a single cross in their pouches to keep the devil from dancing there. By the body of St. Mark, my Prince of Supplies, with his lovely daughter, will have a place in the gallery. What is she, Isaac? Your wife or your daughter? That eastern houri that thou lockest under thy arm, and hide away like a treasure." "She is my daughter Rebecca, if it pleases your grace," said Isaac, nothing embarrassed, or a little embarrassed by the prince's greeting, in which, however, there was at least as much mockery as courtesy to him. "The wiser man thou art," said Prince John, with a peal of laughter. "But daughter or wife, she should be preferred according to her beauty and your own merit. Who sits above there?" he said, bending his eye to the gallery. "Saxton dogs, lolling. Out with them. Let them sit close, and make room for my prince of users and his lovely daughter. I'll make the hinds know that they must share the high place of the synagogue with those to whom the synagogue belongs." Those who occupied the gallery, to whom this injurious and unpolite speech was addressed, were the family of Cedric the Saxton, along with all of his allies and kinsmen, like Athelstane of Coimborough, a person who, on account of his descent from the last Saxon monarchs of England, was held in the highest respect by all of the Saxon natives of the north of England. But with the blood of this ancient royal race, many of their infirmities had also descended to Athelstane. He was comely in countenance, bulky and strong in person, and in the flower of his age, yet inanimate in expression, dull-eyed, heavy-browed, inactive and sluggish in all of his movements, and so slow in resolution that the sobriquet of one of his ancestors was conferred upon him, and he was quite often called Athelstane the Unready. His friends, and he had many who, as well as Cedric, were passionately attached to him, contended that this sluggish temper arose not from a lack of courage, but from mere want of decision. Others said that his hereditary vice of drunkenness had obscured all of his faculties, which had never been very good, and that the passive courage and meek good nature which remained behind were just the dregs of a character that might have been deserving of praise, but of which all the valuable parts had flown off in the progress of a long course of brutal debauchery. It was to this person, such as we have described him, that the prince addressed his imperious command to make way for Isaac and Rebecca. Athelstane, utterly confounded at an order which the manners and feelings of the time rendered so insulting, was unwilling to obey, yet undetermined how he could resist, opposed only the vis interque to the will of John, and without moving, or making any motion whatsoever of obedience, opened his large gray eyes and stared at the prince with an astonishment which had in it something ludicrous. But impatient Prince John regarded it in no such light. "The Saxton porker," said the prince, "is either asleep or minds me not. Poke him with your lance, de Bracy," he said, speaking to a knight who was near him, the leader of a band of free companions, mercenaries belonging to no nation, but attached for the time to any prince by whom they were paid. There was a murmur, even among the attendants of Prince John, but de Bracy, whose profession freed him from all scruple, extended his long lance over the space which separated the gallery from the lists, and, would have executed the commands of the prince before Athelstein the Unready had recovered his presence of mind enough even to pull back from the weapon, if it hadn't been for Cedric. As prompt as Athelstein was unready, he unsheathed his sword with the speed of lightning, the short sword which he always wore, and with one blow severed the point of the lance off of the handle. This made the blood rush into the face of Prince John. He swore one of his deepest oaths, and was about to utter some threat corresponding in violence, when he was diverted from his pursuit, partially by his attendants, who gathered around, conjuring upon him to be patient, and partly by a general exclamation of the crowd, uttered in loud applause, of the spirited conduct of Cedric. The prince rolled his eyes indignantly, as if to collect some safe and easy victim, and chancing to encounter the firm glance of the same archer who we have already noticed, and who seemed to persist in this gesture of applause in spite of the frown on the prince's face, the prince came over and demanded his reason for such noise. "I always add my hullo," said the yeoman, "when I see a good shot or a gallant blow." "What sayest thou?" said Prince John. "Then thou canst hit the white thyself, I warrant." "A woodsman's mark, and at a woodsman's distance I can hit it." "And Wat Terrell's mark at 100 yards?" said a voice behind them, but by whom it was said could not be told. This allusion to the fate of William Rufus, the grandfather, at once incised and alarmed Prince John. He satisfied himself, however, with commanding the men-at-arms who were surrounding the list to keep an eye on the braggart, and he pointed at the man. "By St. Grizzle," he said, "we will try his own skill. He is so ready to give voice to the feats of others." "I won't run from the trial," said the yeoman, with the composure which marked his whole demeanor. "Meanwhile, stand up, you Saxton dogs," said the fiery prince, "for by the light of heaven, since I have said it, the Jewish man shall have his seat among you." "By no means, an it please your grace, it is not fit for such as we to sit with the rulers of this land." I used the wrong voice for Isaac. "By no means, and please your grace, it is not fit for such as we to sit with the rulers of the land," said Isaac, whose ambition for precedence, though it had led him to dispute the place with the extenuated and impoverished descendant from the line of Montdidier, by no means stimulated him to intrude upon the privileges of wealthy Saxtons. "Up, infidel dog, when I command you," said Prince John, "or I will have thy swarthy hide stripped and tanned for horse furniture." Persuaded that way, Isaac began to ascend the steep and narrow stairs leading to the gallery. "And let me see," said Prince John, "who dares to stop him." He fixed his eye upon Cedric, whose attitude intimated his intention to hurl Isaac into the lists. The catastrophe, though, was prevented by the clown Wamba, who, springing between his master and Isaac, and exclaiming in answer to the prince's defiance, "Marry that I will," opposed to the beard of the Jewish man a shield of brawn, which he plucked from beneath his cloak, and with which, doubtless, he had furnished himself, lest the tournament should have proved longer than his appetite could endure. Finding the abomination of his tribe opposed to his very nose, while the jester at the same time flourished his wooden sword above his head, Isaac recoiled, missed his footing, and rolled down the steps. An excellent jest to the spectators, who set up a loud laughter, in which Prince John and his attendants joined in. Deal me the prize, cousin Prince, said Wamba. I have vanquished my foe in a fair fight with sword and shield, he said, brandishing his brawn in one hand and the sword in the other. And who art thou, noble champion? Said Prince John, still laughing. A fool by right of descent, said the jester. I am Wamba, son of Witless, who was the son of Weatherbrain, who was the son of an alderman. Make room for Isaac in the front of the lower ring, said Prince John, not unwilling, perhaps, to seize an apology to desist from his original purpose. To place the vanquished beside the victor would be false heraldry. Knave upon fool were worse, said Wamba, and Isaac upon bacon would be the worst of all. Gramercy, good fellow, said Prince John, thou pleaseth me. Here, Isaac, lend me a handful of money. As Isaac, stunned by this request, and afraid to refuse but unwilling to comply, fumbled in the furred bag which hung by his girdle, and was perhaps endeavoring to ascertain how few coins might pass for a handful, the prince stopped from his jennet and settled Isaac's doubts by snatching the entire pouch itself from his side and flinging to Wamba a couple of the gold pieces that it contained. After that, he pursued his ramble around the lists, leaving Isaac to the derision of all those around him, and himself receiving as much applause from the spectators as if he had done something honest and honorable. And that is the end of the chapter. So I'm definitely starting to feel that most of the Robin Hood myths and most of the Robin Hood tropes might just come from this. I think Ivanhoe might have been one of the first to bring on the whole medieval flavor trope. I'll have to do some more research into it. Or if anybody knows, leave it in the comments down below. That was interesting. Again, the language gets a little dense every now and then, but I think I'm enjoying this story. I'm also waiting for Robin Ivanhoe to come forward and split an arrow in half during some shooting competition. We'll see how many of the Robin Hood tropes we end up seeing as we read through this book. But thank you so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed that chapter, and I will see you for one more night this week. So I will see you tomorrow.